Good morning, dear students. Today we will be talking about a critical piece of work, that is Plato's The Republic. Now, The Republic is a work which talks about so many things like what is an ideal city, how a just governance should take place, and how can people become happy altogether in a republican state. So before going into delving into deep in the crux of what is there in the republic, first let's have a brief view of an overview of who is Plato. Now Plato was an ancient Greek philosopher and he is the student of Socrates, and he is very much influenced by Socrates' philosophical teachings and musings. So we can say that Plato is very much in vogue with what Socrates teaches. Plato is a Greek philosopher who is born in Athens in the year 428 to 427 BC, and that is the classical period of ancient Greek times. And there are certain philosophical groups and academies that were established there at that time, and the students of Plato who followed the philosophical doctrines of Plato were known as the Platonists, and this whole school of thought is known as Platonism. Now we will go deep into what Plato has other things to say about in the Republic. But one most important question which generally raises doubt among the students of English literature is that Plato is very much biased against the poets, and although he praises them at certain points of time, but finally in one word he shuns the poets by saying that in a republican state the poets must be banished. So what is the reason of such a statement? We'll try to probe deeper into it. Now we have already seen that Plato is Socrates' pupil and disciple, and his most important works are the Republic, the Symposium, Allegory of Cave, Theory of Forms, Forms of the Good. He has also talked about cardinal virtues, and virtue is another important part of the Republic. So what he talks about in the Republic? He talks about Republic being a republican state, an ideal state where there is just governance, where there is justice, happiness and virtue. These are the three aspects on which Plato talks about, and says that justice is what which brings virtue in you, and virtue will ultimately lead to happiness. So in order to be happy you have to be just and you have to be virtuous. Now this whole work is in a dialogue form, and Socrates himself is a part of this dialogue. So Socrates presents his views and there are other interlocutors in the text, but we are mostly concerned about the book 10th of the Republic. So what is so important in the book 10th? Book 10th is important because there is where Plato has talked about the poets. So in the initial parts of the book he has talked about how a republican state should govern, what are the important aspects of happiness, virtue and all. But in book 10th he goes back to the poets, who a poet is, how a poet writes, and what are the usefulness of a poet. Now when he talks about poets, Plato is an idealist. So he always believes in the establishment of an idea. And he says that poets are, not creating something new. They are already existing ideas, and all the, artists, be it poets or painters, what do? They just copy the already existing ideas. So that's why they're not doing something new. They are just copying whatever is already present in the world. Now, just like he uses this term, mimesis. Now, mimesis is a Greek word which refers to as, imitation. So, first of all, in book 10th, Plato, through Socrates, tries to say that what are the poets? Poets are basically imitative. They, through this mimesis, through this imitation, try to imitate what is already present. No new ideas, but what are the already present ideas. That's why, what are poets? Poets are, according to Plato, thrice removed from reality. They do not present anything new, they are thrice removed from already existing reality. Now, when we are talking about Plato and when we are talking about what he talks about in the book 10th of the Republic, of course, one is about how poets are imitative. Another is he talks about how poetry is created. So, according to Plato, poetry is created by divine instinct. There is a flash of somewhat inspiration, and when the poet is inspired, at that time poet writes, and that inspiration can come at any interval of time. So there is no fixity of the thought that okay, this will be the perfect time when the poet will be illuminated. So it is something like a gift of God which has come to the poets, and the poets are illuminated at certain point of time, and there they are very much close to the God, and with his intervention and with his divine source, poets write. But that is only in a certain given period of time, that is not for length and always. So poet also says, when he charges against the Plato also says, when he charges against the poets, he says that the best souls are corrupted by poetry. Why? Because it deceives to sympathize with those who grieve excessively. Just trying to say that, you try to overwhelm people with certain ideas which are not your own, and you are also not certain of your ideas. This is what he says about poets. He says that poets themselves do not know what they are writing. And hence, he says that although I regret banishing the poets, but despite the fact it is clear that there is the dangers which brings which is brought into the society by the poets, that's why in order to help the people of the Republic, the poets must be banished from the state. Now, this already I have told you that in the book 10th, Socrates is the one who sums up all what is there. He sums up and defines justice, and then he turns back to poetry. And the questions which had already been raised in the Republic is at last met in the book 10th. And he says that there are three reasons regarding the poets who, because in the fact that they are wholesome and dangerous. And what are the three reasons why the poets are dangerous? First, they pretend to know all sorts of things, but they really do to know nothing. Means whatever the poet is writing about, poet is never sure about what they are writing. Then it is also considered that they have knowledge about what they write, but it in fact is they do not. They do not know, but still they write. They are not, very well scientifically, or you can say well read, or very clear about the thoughts that they want to represent, but still they are representing certain things which they are not sure of. Then he also says that the things that they deal with cannot be known. Like if you see poets are talking about supernatural things or such things which really do not exist, or we are not sure about their existence, then of course it is that they are talking about certain things which is not present there. And they are removed from what is most real. That is what he says, that poets are thrice removed from reality. And by presenting scenes so far removed from the truths, poet basically perverts the soul of the people who are reading the poetry. That's why he says that poetry must be banned from classrooms and poets must be banished from the city itself. Now here we come to consider or understand this fact that again and again Plato is bringing up this charge against the poets, that the poets are imitative, the poets are thrice removed from reality, they are at times infused with the sense of inspiration, but that inspiration is very short-lived and it not happens always, and we cannot describe the nature of that inspiration. It is just by some divine intervention that they are at certain point of time inspired. So there is nothing sure that can be said about the poets, and that's why it is not about it is not going to bring any peace in the republic that the poet is that the Plato is trying to establish in the world. That's why from his republic he feels that the poet must be banished. So, there are certain, quotes from Plato himself that I like to share with you so that you will have a clear understanding of what Plato feels about the poets. Now, first of all, one very important thing is that Plato is a utilitarian. And by utilitarian means that in the Republic you must have the things which can be utilized by the people. It must have some purpose to serve. But Plato feels that poetry is not utilitarian. It has got no purpose. So, quoting from Plato, what does he say about the poets and their utilitarian purposes? He says that the purpose of poetry is that, now quoting him, poetry can serve no useful practical purpose. It must not be a part of school curriculum, unquote. So, poetry can serve no useful practical purpose and it must not be a part of school curriculum, which means that poets are of no use and poetry has no utilitarian purpose of its own. That's why Plato feels that poets are of no use in the Republic. Again, we have already talked about how he feels that there is some divine presence which inspires the poets. So, I am literally quoting from him, quoting Plato. For the poet is a light and winged and holy thing, and there is no invention in him until he has been inspired, and is out of his senses, and the mind is no longer in him. When he has not attained to this state, he is powerless and is unable to utter his oracles, unquote. Which means that there is this certain point of time when poet is suddenly inspired, and then after that, when the inspiration is gone, poet is of no use, and whatever he utters at those times are also not truth. What he is saying that these are oracles, these are some versions of the poet which the poet is creating out of without any real knowledge or truth. Another important quote by Plato is that, quoting him, not by art does the poet sing, but by the power of divine, unquote. Which means that poets are inspired by just one flash of divine inspiration and then suddenly that is gone. And then the most important of all the quotes where he talks about how poetry is thrice removed from reality. So quoting Plato, what does he say? The poet have no knowledge of reality. They simply imitate the shadow or the illusionary. Poetry is thrice removed from reality. It cannot be a source of knowledge or truth, unquote. So here clearly Plato is mentioning that poetry is thrice removed from reality and it is nowhere near the real truth. Excuse me. So summarizing this, what we can say is that Plato has put on so many charges against the poets, and he is one of the earliest of the critics who is charging the poets with such charges, and he is disregarding the poets as of no use. But there are several other critics from time to time who have been criticizing poetry, and there are several critics who have been defending poetry. So you have Stephen Cosson's School of Abuse, where he says that again poets are of no use, but you have Philip Sidney apologizing, Philip Sidney's apology for poetry, where he is defending the poets. Then just like Plato, when Plato is putting up all these charges against the poets, you have Aristotle who will be defending the charges put on by Plato and who will be establishing the authority of poetry. So in our next video we will be talking about Aristotle, and how Aristotle talks about poetry and what according to Aristotle is the definition of poetry. So for that we'll have to wait till that time. always keep in mind that how Plato is never with the poets, and how Plato says that the poets are imitative, they are only prone to mimesis, that is imitation, and they are thrice removed from reality. So that is all for today. Thank you, and we'll meet with another video lecture where we'll be talking about Aristotle and how he defines poetry.